Instead, he would tell her about the beauty of Mexico, the kindness of its people, the richness of its culture. He would build for her the same illusion he had tried to create for himself, that the world was fundamentally good, that peace was possible, that even men of violence could choose a different path. As his plane lifted off from Puerto Vallarta International Airport, Frank gazed down at the coastline falling away beneath him. Somewhere in that sprawling city, 5 men were telling their friends about their encounter with an American grandfather who commanded helicopter gunships and elite soldiers. The story would grow with each telling becoming legend. Frank smiled at the thought. Perhaps that was legacy enough for an old warrior, not the classified missions or the lives taken in service to country, but the final act of mercy, when vengeance had been within his grasp. His phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Location secure, mission complete. Take care, Dad." Frank typed back, "Love you, son, thank you." Then he turned off his phone and closed his eyes, allowing himself to drift into sleep as the aircraft carried him toward new horizons. In his dreams, there were no wars, no missions, no violence, only the peace he had spent a lifetime fighting for but never truly found. Until now, perhaps. Until now. 3 months later, at a rundown bar on the outskirts of Puerto Vallarta, a tourist was being harassed by local troublemakers. The bartender, noticing the situation escalating, leaned across the counter toward the group. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he warned, his voice low but clear. The leader of the group laughed. "Why not? He's just another rich American." The bartender glanced meaningfully at the ceiling, where the distant sound of helicopter rotors could be heard passing overhead. A routine border patrol, nothing more. "The last old American who was bothered in this town," the bartender said, "turned out to have friends. Very powerful friends who came from the sky." The troublemakers exchanged looks, their bravado faltering. The bearded one among them unconsciously rubbed his wrists, as if feeling phantom restraints. "Let's go somewhere else," he muttered, backing away from the tourist who remained blissfully unaware of what had nearly happened, or of the legend that had saved him. Outside, the night sky was clear, the stars brilliant above the Mexican coastline. Somewhere across that same sky, Frank Dawson sat on a terrace in Santorini, watching a similar array of stars and thinking about the nature of peace and the long shadows cast by a lifetime of violence. He would never know about the tourist who had been spared because of him, just as the tourist would never know about the old warrior whose legacy had protected him. But perhaps that was the point of it all. The connections we never see, the ripples we create without knowing, the ways in which mercy can echo long after vengeance has faded. Frank raised his glass to the night sky in a silent toast. To retirement, yes. But also to something he had never expected to find after so many years of war. The possibility of redemption. The convenience store owner stared wide-eyed through the window. "Federales?" she asked, her voice hushed. Frank shook his head. "SWAT," he corrected her. "My son's unit." The first vehicle stopped outside the store and Michael emerged, dressed in full tactical gear, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him, 16 operators deployed, weapons ready, communications equipment linking them to the helicopters overhead. When Michael saw his father, bloodied, bruised, his clothes torn, something dangerous flashed across his face. He'd seen Frank injured before, had grown up with a father who sometimes returned from business trips with unexplained wounds, but never like this. Never as an old man victimized by common thugs. "Description?" Michael asked, his voice clipped. Frank gave him details, the snake tattoo, the bearded leader, the motorcycles. Michael relayed this information to his team, then turned back to his father. "We're running a cartel interdiction exercise 10 miles from here," he explained, though Frank hadn't asked. "Official jurisdiction. Full tactical authority." Frank understood what his son wasn't saying. Michael's unit had legal clearance to operate in Mexican territory. What they were about to do would be covered by that operational mandate, regardless of whether it had anything to do with cartels. "We'll find them," Michael promised. Frank nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his 82 years. "I know you, Will." What followed was a demonstration of American military efficiency that would have made Frank's old unit proud. Surveillance footage from city cameras was accessed. Local informants were questioned. The helicopters swept the city, their thermal imaging systems identifying motorcycle heat signatures. It took 35 minutes to locate them, gathered at a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, celebrating their successful hunt with cheap tequila and cheaper women. Michael insisted Frank remain in the lead vehicle as they approached the location. "You should see this," was all he said. The bar's patrons scattered as the helicopters hovered overhead, spotlights illuminating the dusty parking lot where 5 motorcycles stood in a haphazard line. The SWAT team deployed with military precision, surrounding the building, securing exits, establishing a perimeter that not even a ghost could have slipped through. Michael spoke into his radio, his voice echoing through loudspeakers mounted on the vehicles. "This is a U.S. law enforcement operation in conjunction with Mexican authorities. We are searching for individuals connected to cartel activities. Everyone inside the building come out with your hands visible." People began to emerge, waitstaff, customers, a few women in revealing clothes. They were directed to a holding area, identified and released if they weren't among the targets. And then they appeared. The 5 men who had beaten Frank hours earlier, their arrogance replaced by confusion and fear as they faced the overwhelming force arrayed against them. "Those are them," Frank confirmed, watching through the vehicle's window. What happened next occurred with such speed and precision that he almost missed it. On some silent signal from Michael, his operators moved. The 5 men were separated, isolated and subdued before they could offer any resistance. Zip-tied and hooded, they were loaded into separate vehicles. Michael returned to where his father waited. "We've got them," he said. "They'll be processed through the system properly." Frank studied his son's face, so much like his own had been decades ago, and knew he was lying. "What system?" he asked quietly. A muscle twitched in Michael's jaw. "The one that ensures justice is served." He helped Frank from the vehicle, leading him to where the bearded leader of the group knelt on the ground, hands bound behind him, hood covering his face. With a quick motion, Michael removed the hood, revealing the man's wide, frightened eyes. Recognition dawned as he looked up at Frank. "You?" he whispered in disbelief. Frank stared down at him, this man who had thought him weak, who had taken pleasure in hurting someone he perceived as defenseless. Behind Frank stood his son and 16 elite operators, helicopters circling overhead, the full might of American military precision focused on 5 small-time criminals who had chosen the wrong victim. "My father has something to say to you," Michael announced, his voice carrying to his team. The parking lot fell silent. Even the helicopters seemed to hover more quietly, as if waiting for Frank's words. Frank knelt down, ignoring the pain in his ribs, until he was eye level with the man who had beaten him. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice steady. "I've killed more men than you've ever met. I've toppled governments and prevented wars. I am not just an old American tourist. I am what stands between civilization and chaos." Fear turned the man's face pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "But today," Frank continued, "I'm going to show you mercy. Not because you deserve it, but because I've seen enough blood in my lifetime." He stood, turning to Michael. "Take what they stole from me and let them go." Surprise flickered across Michael's face, followed by understanding. He nodded to his team, who proceeded to search the 5 men, recovering Frank's wallet, phone, and watch. The souvenir, his granddaughter's gift, was gone, lost in the gutter where it had been tossed. "Release them," Michael ordered. As the zip ties were cut, Frank watched the confusion on the faces of their captives. They had expected torture, perhaps death. Instead, they were being set free. The bearded leader rubbed his wrists, eyeing Frank warily. "Why?" he asked. "Because now you'll live with the knowledge that your life was in my hands," Frank answered. And if you ever touch another tourist, another human being, I'll know. And next time, I won't be so forgiving." They left them, there standing in the dust as the convoy departed. In the helicopter flying back to Frank's hotel, Michael sat beside his father, studying his face. "You surprised me," Michael admitted. "I thought you'd want them punished." Frank looked out at the city lights below them, thinking of all the violence he'd seen and caused throughout his long life. "There's been enough punishment," he said finally. "Maybe it's time for something else." But as they flew through the night sky, Frank couldn't help but wonder if he'd made the right choice. Peace had always been more difficult for him than war, forgiveness harder than vengeance. Perhaps true retirement wasn't about leaving the battlefield, but about choosing which battles were worth fighting. When they landed at a private airstrip near Frank's hotel, Michael insisted on having his medic examine his father's injuries. 2 cracked ribs, multiple contusions, a mild concussion. Painful but not life-threatening for a man who had survived far worse. "You could press charges," Michael suggested as the medic wrapped Frank's ribs. "We have them on surveillance assaulting you. It would be an open and shut case." Frank shook his head. "No, it's over." Michael didn't argue, but Frank could see the frustration in his eyes. The son wanting justice for his father. The soldier wanting punishment for those who had violated his code. "I'm proud of you," Frank told him, reaching out to grip his arm. "Not for tonight, but for the man you've become. Your mother would be proud too." At the mention of his mother, Frank's first wife, lost to cancer 20 years ago, Michael's expression softened. "She always said you were the strongest man she knew, not because of what you could do, but because of what you chose not to do." They parted at the hotel, Michael's team disappearing into the night as quietly as they had arrived. Frank watched, the helicopters fade into the distance, carrying with them the last echoes of the violence that had defined so much of his life. In his room, Frank stood at the window overlooking the ocean, the same view he had admired with a tequila toast just hours earlier. Everything looked identical, yet nothing was the same. In the space of one evening, he had been reminded of both his fragility and his power, an old man vulnerable to physical attack, yet connected to forces that could descend from the sky at his word. He thought of the 5 men they had captured and released. Would they learn from this encounter? Would they change? Or would they simply find easier targets, ones without sons commanding elite tactical units? As dawn broke over Puerto Vallarta, Frank made a decision. His vacation would continue, but not here. There were other places to see, other experiences to have in whatever time remained to him. The world was vast, and he had spent too much of his life in its shadows. He booked a flight to Barcelona, a city he had once visited on an operation but never truly seen. From there, perhaps Greece or Morocco. Places where history stretched, back thousands of years, reminding even old men like him that their time is but a blink in the great span of human existence. Before leaving his hotel, Frank purchased another souvenir for his granddaughter, this one a delicate silver bracelet, inlaid with turquoise, far more elegant than the painted figurine that had been destroyed. He had it shipped directly to her home in Virginia, with a note promising to tell her the story behind it someday. Not the true story, of course. She was only 12, too young to understand the darkness that had lived inside her grandfather all these years. Too innocent to comprehend how close those 5 men had come to death at the hands of American special forces because they had chosen the wrong elderly tourist to rob. The sound of a neck breaking has always reminded observers of a thick branch snapping during winter frost. Clean, definitive, final. Frank Dawson hadn't heard that sound in nearly 30 years, not since his last mission in Kashmir. Yet here, he was, an 82-year-old man with arthritis in both knees, listening to that unmistakable crack. Before we begin, put the word justice in the comments, if you believe in justice. 3 weeks earlier, Frank was navigating the crowded streets of New Delhi, sweat dampening his collar despite the lightweight linen shirt he'd purchased specifically for this trip. The air hung heavy with spices, exhaust fumes, and the persistent buzz of millions of lives intersecting in organized chaos. "You're sure about this intel, Frank?" The voice in his earpiece belonged to Director Shapiro, a man half his age who'd never seen combat but somehow found himself in charge of veteran operatives like Frank. "Positive," Frank muttered, keeping his voice low as he moved through the market. "Pakistan's moving something across the border tonight. Not troops. Something worse. He had been pulled out of semi-retirement for this mission. His extensive experience in the India-Pakistan conflict made him the only viable candidate for a delicate reconnaissance operation. The official stance was that tensions between the nuclear powers were de-escalating, but intelligence suggested otherwise. "We need confirmation, not speculation." Shapiro's voice crackled. "The Pentagon doesn't want another false alarm." Frank ignored him, focusing instead on the man he'd been following for the past 20 minutes. Amir Khatri, mid-level intelligence officer for Pakistan's ISI, was meeting someone he shouldn't be meeting in a part of Delhi where he had no business being. As darkness fell, Frank tracked Khatri to an abandoned warehouse near the Yamuna River. The smell of sewage and industrial waste hung in the air as he positioned himself on a neighboring rooftop, night vision binoculars trained on the building's entrance. What he witnessed that night would be his final contribution to American intelligence. 3 unmarked trucks, 6 men with radiation detection equipment, and a single lead-lined container the size of a refrigerator. "Are you seeing this?" Frank whispered into his comm. "Jesus Christ." Shapiro's voice had lost its bureaucratic edge. "That's a portable nuclear component." Within hours, the information had reached the highest levels of government. Within days, a covert diplomatic intervention had prevented what could have been the first nuclear confrontation since the Cold War. And within weeks, Frank was officially done, retired after 60 years of service to a country that would never know what he'd done for it. His government pension was substantial, his health surprisingly good for a man who'd been shot 4 times and stabbed twice over the course of his career. Frank decided it was finally time to see something of the world without having to kill anyone in it, which is how he found himself in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, enjoying the sunset from his oceanfront hotel room with a glass of good tequila in hand. 2. Retirement. He toasted the empty room, watching as the golden sun melted into the Pacific. The warmth of the liquor spread through his chest, easing the dull ache that had taken up permanent residence there. His son Michael had called earlier, that day. He was running tactical exercises with his SWAT unit somewhere along the border, training for cartel interdiction operations. "You sure you're okay down there alone, Dad?" he'd asked, the concern in his voice making him sound like the parent rather than the child. "I've survived 3 wars and 2 marriages," Frank reminded him. "I think I can handle a Mexican vacation." Michael had laughed, but the worry remained. "Just keep your phone on you. If you need anything." "I won't," Frank had interrupted, "but I appreciate it." After finishing his drink, he decided to take a walk into town. The evening air was warm, carrying the scent of salt and grilled seafood. Tourists and locals mingled in the streets, the atmosphere festive and light. For the first time in decades, Frank allowed himself to relax, to simply exist without scanning for threats or planning exits. That was his first mistake. He spotted a small souvenir shop, tucked between larger establishments, its windows displaying colorful Day of the Dead figurines and hand-painted tiles. His granddaughter's birthday was approaching, and he thought a genuine Mexican keepsake might please her more than the mass-produced airport gift shop options. As Frank exited the shop 30 minutes later, small package tucked under his arm, he noticed them. 5 men on motorcycles watching him with the predatory focus he recognized from decades of dealing with humanity's darker elements. They weren't cartel, too disorganized, too obvious. Local. Troublemakers, perhaps, or opportunistic criminals looking for an easy target. And in him they saw exactly that, an elderly American tourist, alone and vulnerable. Frank assessed his options. His hotel was 4 blocks away. His sidearm was locked in the room safe, Mexican gun laws being what they were. His body, while still strong for his age, no longer moved with the speed or power it once had. He began walking, maintaining a steady pace, hoping they might choose an easier mark. But the rumble of engines behind him confirmed what he already knew. He'd been selected. The first motorcycle pulled alongside him, its rider a young man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck. "Hola, abuelo," he said, his tone mockingly respectful. "You look lost." "I'm fine, thank you," Frank replied, continuing to walk. A second bike blocked his path, forcing him to stop. The rider, heavier than the first, dismounted and approached him. "Americans always carry cash," he said in accented English. "Very dangerous in this neighborhood. You should let us escort you back to your hotel." Frank straightened his posture, meeting the man's gaze directly. "I was killing men before you were born," he said quietly. "Walk away now." They laughed, all five of them, the sound echoing off the buildings of the now deserted street. Frank had made his second mistake, revealing his pride instead of playing the frightened tourist. What followed was quick and humiliating. A blow to the back of Frank's knee sent him to the ground. Hands rifled through his pockets, taking his wallet, watch, and phone. Someone yanked the package from his grasp, tearing the wrapping. "Just a stupid doll," one of them spat, tossing his granddaughter's gift into the gutter. The largest one, a bearded man with arms covered in crude tattoos, grabbed Frank by his shirt collar, pulling him up to face him. "Maybe we should teach this old American a lesson," he said, his breath hot against Frank's face. "Show him some Mexican hospitality." Punch caught Frank in the stomach, driving the air from his lungs. As he doubled over, a second blow struck his ribs. He felt something crack, white-hot pain blooming across his side. They took turns, these young men, beating an 82-year-old veteran who had once been feared by enemies of state. With each blow, each kick, each mocking laugh, something inside Frank shifted. Not just bones, but something fundamental. The careful control he'd maintained for decades began to fracture. When they finally tired of their game, the bearded one spat on Frank as he lay on the pavement. "Welcome to Mexico, grandfather," he sneered. The sound of their motorcycles faded as they rode away, leaving Frank bleeding and broken on the street. He didn't know how long he lay there before finding the strength to stand. Pain radiated through his body as he limped toward the nearest open business, a small convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights. The young woman behind the counter gasped when Frank entered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Senor, you need a hospital." "I will call an ambulance." "No ambulance," Frank said, his voice a rasp. "Just a phone." She hesitated, then handed him her cell phone. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number Michael had made him memorize. Not his personal line, but a direct connection to his tactical unit. When Michael answered, his voice was professional, detached. "Operative Dawson." "It's Dad," Frank said, the words catching in his throat. "I need help." There was a moment of silence. Then, in a voice Frank hadn't heard since Michael was a small boy frightened by nightmares. "What happened?" Frank told him, not everything, but enough. Location. Description of the attackers. Their motorcycles. As he spoke, he could hear Michael issuing orders, his voice shifting from concerned son to commanding officer. 25 minutes, Michael said finally. "Find somewhere safe and wait. Can you do that?" Frank thought of the men who had beaten him, who had taken his dignity along with his possessions, men who thought they could assault a U.S. veteran with impunity. "Yes," he answered. "I can do that." The convenience store owner insisted Frank sit, brought him water, dabbed at the blood on his face with a clean cloth. He thanked her absently, his mind already shifting to what would happen next. Because he knew his son. He knew what Michael commanded, and he knew what was coming for the men who had attacked him. Exactly 23 minutes after his call, the first helicopter appeared, over the city, its searchlight cutting through the night. The sound of its rotors drowned out the music from nearby bars and restaurants. A second helicopter followed, and then came the vehicles, black SUVs with government plates, moving with precision through streets suddenly vacant of pedestrians.